Welcome back to Hidden Badges Stories. I'm glad you're here. Whether you're listening from your couch, your car, your kitchen, or somewhere you go when the world gets a little too loud. Before we begin, if this story moves you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. It means more than you know. Now settle in, this one's going to stay with you. The finest neurologists in the Pacific Northwest had already made their decision about Colonel Harlan Voss, United States Army, retired. They'd written it in clean clinical language across 17 pages of discharge summary, handed it to his daughter in a manila envelope, and sent them both home with a pamphlet about long-term care facilities in the greater Portland area. 15 years in a wheelchair. 15 years of waking up every morning and not being able to feel anything below his chest. 15 years of doctors who reviewed his scans, nodded slowly, and told his daughter Ingrid the same thing in slightly different words. The damage is irreversible. There is nothing more to be done. Ingrid Voss Hartley had heard that sentence so many times it had stopped sounding like medicine and started sounding like a door closing. She was 41 years old. She had taken a leave of absence from her job as a high school history teacher 3 times in the last decade to manage her father's care. She had driven him to appointments in Seattle, in San Francisco, in Houston. She had sat in waiting rooms with fluorescent lighting and outdated magazines and held her father's hand when yet another specialist told him what he already knew. She was done with specialists, which is why, on a gray Tuesday morning in late October, she drove her father's adapted van not to the gleaming towers of Portland General's neurology wing, but to the emergency department of St. Crispen's Medical Center. A mid-sized community hospital in the industrial east side of the city, the kind of place that didn't have its name on a research building or a wing sponsored by a tech billionaire. The kind of place where the waiting room chairs were cracked vinyl and the coffee machine in the corner took exact change. It wasn't desperation, exactly. Ingrid had a lead. She'd spent 4 months on veteran support forums, reading accounts from men and women who'd come home broken in ways that the VA couldn't categorize, and she'd found a thread, buried, almost deleted, reposted by someone named Old Ranger 7, about a nurse in Portland, an ER nurse who had done something that 3 board-certified physicians said was impossible, who had looked at a retired Green Beret with a spinal compression nobody could explain and asked questions nobody else had thought to ask. The thread didn't have the nurse's name, just the hospital, and the color of her scrubs. The ER at St. Crispen's on a Tuesday morning was the controlled chaos it always was. A man with a kitchen injury in Bay 2, a teenager with a dislocated shoulder in Bay 4, a woman in her 70s who'd fainted at the grocery store, sitting upright now and annoyed about the whole thing, and at the nurse's station, moving with the particular efficiency of someone who wasted nothing. Not a step, not a word, not a second. Was a woman in bright blue scrubs. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, maybe younger, maybe older. It was genuinely hard to tell. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, no jewelry except a plain watch, and the kind of face that didn't announce itself. You could walk past her in a hallway and not register her, which, Ingrid would later understand, was entirely intentional. Her name was Cora Sutton. She had been an ER nurse at St. Crispen's for 4 years. Before that, her personnel file, the civilian one, the only one that existed in any database a hospital administrator could access, showed a 2-year gap listed as private sector work. Before that, nursing school at the University of Washington. Before that, undergraduate biology. Everything clean, everything sequential, everything exactly as unremarkable as she needed it to be. The other file, the one that required a security clearance to open, the one that had her call sign at the top where her name should be. That one told a different story. But nobody at St. Crispen's had that clearance, and Cora had never volunteered the information. She went by suds to the medics who'd served alongside her, a nickname earned during a field extraction in a place she still couldn't name, when she'd improvised a sterile solution from whatever she had in her kit and kept a man's leg attached to his body, long enough to get him to a surgical unit. The medics thought it was funny. Cora had never thought it was funny. She'd just done what needed doing. That was, essentially, her entire biography. She was charting at the nurse's station when Ingrid came through the automatic doors pushing her father's wheelchair. Cora clocked them in the first 3 seconds. The daughter's posture, the way she was holding herself too straight, the micro-tension around her jaw that said, "I have been disappointed so many times, I'm already braced for it to happen again." The father, older gray, sitting with the specific stillness of someone who had learned not to expect much from rooms like this one, military bearing even in stillness, the set of his shoulders, the way his hands rested on the armrests, not gripping, just resting with a kind of deliberate calm. She went back to her chart. It wasn't her intake. The triage nurse, a pleasant man named Barry who'd been at St. Crispen's longer than anyone else on the floor, was already walking toward them. Cora was 3 bays away when she heard the attending come in. Dr. Philip Okafor was not a bad physician. He was, in fact, a competent one. Thorough with his differential, fast with his orders, respected by the residents who rotated through his service. He was also a man who had strong opinions about scope of practice, the proper use of emergency department resources, and the type of patient who, in his clinical judgment, belonged in a specialist's office rather than an ER bay. He reviewed the intake form for Colonel Harlan Voss, looked at the daughter, and made his assessment in approximately 90 seconds. Monsieur Voss Hartley, he said, in the measured tone of a man who had delivered difficult news before and found a formula that worked. I understand you've been managing your father's condition for a long time, and I can see this has been an exhausting journey for your family. But what you're describing, a 15-year spinal injury with complete motor loss, isn't something that an emergency department is equipped to evaluate. We're not set up for long-term neurological. I'm not asking for a long-term evaluation, Ingrid said. She kept her voice very level. I'm asking for someone to look at him, to actually look at him, because everyone who was supposed to help him has just looked at his records. Dr. Okafor paused. His records are extensive, and they say what the last doctor told them to say, Ingrid said. That's all they say. There was a silence, not a comfortable one. I'll have Barry finish the intake, Dr. Okafor said, and we'll see what we can do. But I want to be honest with you about expectations. He left. Ingrid stood very still for a moment, then sat down in the chair beside her father's wheelchair and put her face in her hands. Not crying, just holding herself together with the particular effort of someone who had been holding it together for a very long time. Harlan Voss reached over and put his hand on his daughter's knee. It's all right, Ingrid, he said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had spent 31 years giving orders in situations considerably worse than this one. We knew it might go this way. I know, she said from behind her hands. Then take a breath, he said. One at a time. That's all. Cora had heard all of it. She wasn't trying to overhear. The bay curtains were thin and the department was the department. She finished her charting, stood up and walked past Bay 7 on her way to the supply room. She slowed, just slightly, just enough, and looked at the man in the wheelchair. She looked at his hands, the way they were resting. She looked at the angle of his neck. She stopped. Excuse me, she said, stepping into the bay. Colonel Voss. Harlan looked up. Ingrid looked up. I'm one of the nurses on this shift. She addressed him directly, not his daughter, not his records, him. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to ask, did you serve Army or Marine Corps? Harlan studied her for a moment. Army, he said. Ranger Battalion, then Special Forces. Retired at 06. Yes, sir, she said. What years were you active duty? He told her. She nodded slowly, something moving behind her eyes that wasn't quite recognition, more like a key turning in a lock. Were you ever deployed to a forward operating base in the early 2000s? Specifically in environments with significant particulate exposure, burn pits, structural demolition, that kind of thing? Ingrid stood up. Why are you asking about burn pits? Every doctor we've seen has dismissed. I'm not dismissing anything, Cora said quietly. I'm asking because I want to understand the timeline. She looked at Harlan again. When did the weakness start? Not the paralysis, the weakness before it, do you remember? Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. A subtle thing, the kind of shift you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. About 8 months after I got back from my last deployment, he said. Started in my feet. Doctor said it was stress, said it was age, said it was. He stopped, said a lot of things. Cora nodded. And was there anything in your kit during that deployment? Anything you were issued for environmental exposure? Any kind of protective equipment, supplemental medications, anything unusual? Harlan looked at her for a long moment. There was a protocol, he said slowly. Late 2003, they were running a program, something about nerve agent prophylaxis in high-exposure environments. We were told it was routine, standard. Do you remember what it was called? Another long pause. We called it the packet, he said. Little foil pouch. Took it every morning for about 6 weeks. The room was very still. Cora straightened up. She had the look, Ingrid would later tell people, of someone who had just heard the last piece of a sentence they'd been waiting 15 years to finish. I need to get Dr. Okafor, she said. I need you to stay right here. Don't let anyone move you. She was already out of the bay. Barry looked up from the nurse's station as she came toward him, at a pace that was not quite running, but was not walking either. Suds, he said. He'd heard the nickname somewhere, the way nicknames traveled. What's happening? I need the attending, she said. Now. And I need you to pull anything we have on Gulf War-era nerve agent prophylaxis programs, specifically pyridostigmine bromide compound protocols. If we don't have it in the system, I need you to call the VA research line, the numbers in the military health contacts folder. Barry stared at her. Cora, I know what it sounds like, she said. Pull it anyway. Dr. Okafor appeared from behind the curtain of Bay 2, where he'd been reviewing an X-ray. He looked at Cora with the particular expression of a man who was competent and therefore did not love being interrupted mid-thought. Nurse Sutton, he said. I need 2 minutes, she said. Please. Something in her voice, not urgency exactly, but precision. The kind of tone that came from someone who had learned to communicate maximum information in minimum time in environments where there was no margin, made him stop. 2 minutes, he said. She gave him one. She laid out the timeline, the deployment, the protocol, the foil packet, the specific sequence of symptoms, distal weakness progressing proximally, 8 months post-exposure. In a pattern she had seen documented in exactly 3 case studies from veterans of that particular operational period who had received the combined prophylactic compound under field conditions. A compound that, in a small subset of individuals with a specific enzyme deficiency, created an inflammatory cascade in the myelin sheath over time, slow, progressive, mimicking primary spinal cord injury in every scan, invisible to every standard diagnostic protocol, because nobody was looking for it, because nobody knew to look for it, because the program had been discontinued and the records had been classified, and the men who'd taken the packet had come home and gotten sick in ways that didn't match anything in the textbook. Dr. Okafor was quiet for a long moment. "That's a significant claim," he said. "Yes," she said. "The literature on PB compound toxicity in long term is limited," she said. "I know. There are 3 published case studies and 1 unpublished VA report from 2019 that was never widely circulated. I can get you the citations. But the pattern fits, the timeline fits, and if I'm right, there's a treatment protocol. It's been used in 2 of the 3 cases. It's not guaranteed, but it's something, and right now he has nothing." Dr. Okafor looked at her. "How do you know about an unpublished VA report?" he said. Cora met his eyes. "I read a lot," she said. He held her gaze for another second. Then he turned and walked toward Bay 7. What happened over the next 4 hours was, by the standards of emergency medicine, not dramatic. There were blood draws. There were phone calls. To the VA, to a researcher at Walter Reed who answered on the 3rd ring and went very quiet when Dr. Okafor described the case and then said, "Give me the patient's service number and don't do anything until I call you back." There was a neurologist brought in from the neurology floor. A woman named Dr. Anand who came down with her laptop in a look of deep skepticism that shifted. Over the course of 40 minutes looking at Harlan's history through the new lens Cora had provided, into something more like stunned attention. There was a conversation with Harlan that Dr. Okafor and Cora conducted together, which was unusual. Nurses did not typically sit in on physician-patient consultations at St. Crispen's, and Dr. Okafor would have been within his rights to ask her to wait outside. He didn't. He pulled up a second chair. Harlan listened to everything. When they finished, he was quiet for a moment. "So you're telling me," he said, "that it might not be my spine." "We don't know yet," Dr. Okafor said carefully. "We need to run specific tests that haven't been run before. And even if the hypothesis is correct, we're looking at a treatment path that is experimental," Harlan said. "Investigational," Dr. Okafor said. "There's a distinction, Colonel," Cora said. It was the first time she'd used his rank since introducing herself, and he noticed it. "I want to be honest with you. I can't promise this leads anywhere. The cases I know about, 1 man recovered partial function, 1 recovered nearly full, 1 didn't respond to treatment at all. I'm not telling you this fixes everything. I'm telling you it's a door that nobody opened." Harlan looked at her for a long time. "Who are you?" he said, not rudely, genuinely. "A nurse," she said. "That's not what I mean." She held his gaze. "That's all I can tell you right now, sir." He studied her face, the set of her jaw, the posture, the particular stillness she carried, that most people read as reserve but that he recognized from a different context, from a specific kind of training, from men and women he'd served alongside who'd learned to be quiet in exactly this way. "All right," he said finally. "Open the door." The testing took 3 weeks. Cora was not Harlan's assigned nurse for any of those weeks. He was admitted to the medical floor, out of her department, out of her rotation. But she checked in. She stopped by on her breaks, not officially, not as part of anyone's care plan. She answered Ingrid's texts at 11 o'clock at night when the anxiety got too loud. She pulled research papers and sent them to Dr. Anand with brief notes in the margins. "See Figure 3, this may be relevant." And Dr. Anand, to her credit, read every one. On the 19th day, Harlan Voss moved the toes of his left foot. It wasn't dramatic. He was lying in the hospital bed, and Cora was sitting in the chair beside it. She'd stopped in after her shift, still in her blue scrubs, a cup of bad coffee going cold in her hand. And he looked down, and there it was, a small movement. Almost nothing. He looked at it for a moment without speaking, then he said, that was all. But his eyes were bright in a way they hadn't been. Cora set down her coffee. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay," he said. The treatment was slow. There were setbacks. There was a week in the 3rd month where the inflammation response spiked and everything seemed to reverse. And Ingrid sat in the hallway outside her father's room and cried in a way she hadn't let herself cry in 15 years. And Cora sat beside her and didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say. She just stayed. That was the thing about Cora. She stayed. By month 5, Harlan was standing, with support, with a walker for 30 seconds at a time. By month 7, he was taking steps. The morning he walked the length of the PT corridor at the VA Rehabilitation Center, 22 feet, with a cane, with a physical therapist named Don hovering 3 inches to his left. His daughter was there, and Don was there, and Dr. Anand was there because she'd cleared her afternoon to be. and a researcher from Walter Reed who had flown in from DC was there. And there were other people whose presence Ingrid couldn't quite account for later. People who seemed to materialize and then disappear. Cora was not there. She had a shift. But when Harlan got to the end of the corridor and stopped and turned around, Dawn said, "Colonel, there's someone on the phone for you," and held out his cell. Harlan took it. "You did that," Cora's voice said from whatever part of the hospital she was standing in. "I want you to know that. I found the door. You walked through it." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous way to put it, Sutton." "It's accurate," she said. "I've been trying to figure out who you are," he said. "Not just a nurse. I know that. Don't bother denying it." A pause. "Someone who's been in places where you learn what questions to ask," she said finally. "That's all, sir. That's more than most," he said. Ingrid would later say that what happened over the following weeks was something she hadn't expected and couldn't have prepared for. Not the medical side, the slow, painstaking, sometimes painful work of her father's recovery, but the other thing. The thing that happened when a story like this one gets out. Dr. Anand published a case study. Walter Reed followed with a joint report. The VA opened an inquiry into the prophylactic compound program and began quietly contacting veterans who had participated in it. There were more than anyone had acknowledged. The story was picked up by 2 veteran advocacy organizations and then by a journalist at a Portland paper who'd been covering military health issues for a decade, and recognized immediately what she was looking at. The nurse's name came out. It always does. Cora did one interview. Exactly one. She sat in a chair in the hospital's media room, in her blue scrubs, and answered questions for 22 minutes with the same economy she brought to everything else. Precise, direct, not unfriendly, not particularly interested in being celebrated. "I looked at a patient," she said, when the journalist asked her how she'd done it. "I asked him questions. That's the job." "But you knew something that nobody else knew," the journalist said. "How?" Cora thought about that for a moment. "I've worked in environments where you pay attention to everything," she said. "Because missing something has consequences. I brought that here. That's all. Can you be more specific about those environments?" "No," she said pleasantly. The journalist tried 3 more times, from 3 different angles. Cora answered the same way each time, without annoyance, without evasion, with the patient stillness of someone who had been asked harder questions in harder rooms and had learned exactly how much to give. After the interview, she went back to the ER. Barry was at the nurse's station when she came through the door. He looked at her and then looked back at his chart. "How was the fame?" he asked. "Terrible," she said. "What do we have? Bay 3 needs a line. Bay 6 is a chest pain, Dr. Okafor's on it. Bay 8 is a kid with a laceration. Parents are anxious. I'll take 8, she said, and was already moving. 6 months after Harlan Voss walked the length of that PT corridor, he was living in his own house again. He used a cane on his bad days, nothing on the good ones. He'd started going to the Veterans Center on Tuesday mornings, not as a patient but as a volunteer. Sitting with men and women who'd come home carrying things they couldn't name, listening the way he'd learned to listen from someone who was very good at it. On a Tuesday in April, he drove himself to St. Crispen's. Not because he needed anything. He parked in the visitor lot, walked through the automatic doors, walked with his cane, no chair, and asked at the front desk for Cora Sutton. "She's on shift," the woman at the desk said. "I can leave her a sedge." "Please tell her Colonel Voss is here," he said. "Tell her I'll wait." He sat in one of the cracked vinyl chairs in the waiting room and waited. 20 minutes later, she came through the doors in her blue scrubs, coffee in hand, moving at the same unhurried pace she always moved at, and she stopped when she saw him standing. She looked at him for a moment, at his face, at the cane he was holding but not leaning on, at the way he was standing straight, the particular posture of a man who had taken his body back from somewhere it had been a very long time. Something moved across her face, quickly, then it was gone and she was just Cora again, quiet, composed, exactly as unremarkable as she needed to be. "You drove here," she said. "I did," he said, and walked in. "I did." She nodded slowly. "I wanted to bring you something," he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small object, a challenge coin, the kind passed between service members, thick and worn at the edges. He held it out to her, Ranger coin. "I've been carrying that since 2001. Cora looked at it. "Sir," she said carefully. "I looked up the Walter Reed report," he said. "The acknowledgments." He paused. The consultant listed as anonymous clinical collaborator, the one who provided the original hypothesis. She met his eyes and said nothing. "Call sign, Sutton," he said quietly. "What is it?" A long pause. "Ghost," she said. So quietly he almost missed it. He nodded once. Like it made sense, like it fit. "Take the coin," he said. "You earned it a long time before you met me." She took it, turned it once in her fingers. Then she closed her hand around it and put it in the pocket of her scrubs. "Thank you for coming in, Colonel," she said. "Thank you for being here," he said. She looked at him for one more moment. Something in her eyes that wasn't quite a smile, but was something. And then she turned and walked back through the doors, back to the bay, back to the work. Back to being no one in particular in a hallway full of people who needed someone to pay attention. That's all this story is about, really. Paying attention. Asking the question that nobody else thought to ask. Staying when it would have been easier to go. The best care I've ever seen doesn't come from the biggest hospital or the most impressive degree on the wall. It comes from someone who looks at another human being and decides, quietly, without announcement, that they're going to find the door. Thank you for listening to Hidden Badges Stories. If this one got to you, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. If you know someone who's been told there's nothing more to be done, share this with them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. There are more stories where this one came from. I'll see you in the next one.